terms of industrialization. And those are some of the issues and topics that we'll be addressing today with our panelists. So the structure is going to be an introduction from Honorable Minister of Finance of Ivory Coast, Madame Nyale Kaba, who's going to talk about Ivory Coast and how Equatorial Guinea and Ivory Coast can cooperate and the lessons learned in terms of industrialization, structural transformation, and harnessing opportunities. Then there'll be a one-on-one interview with His Excellency Auguste Mba Bogo, who's been a fantastic host to all of us over the past few days. And congratulations, Your Excellency. And there'll be a one-on-one interview on what's happened in the country over the past few years, the massive transformation, the challenges ahead, and how they're addressing those. And then we'll go into our panel with our esteemed panelists. And we've got a number of different viewpoints and perspectives, which would make for a fascinating hour and a half. And what we'll do is we'll also open it up to the audience for the last 30 minutes. So you can do the grilling and the tough posing of questions and hopefully get the answers that you're looking for. So first of all, a warm round of applause for the Honorable Minister, Nyale Kaba from Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire. Bienvenue.
Monsieur le
Vice President of the African Development Bank, the Honorable Minister of Economic Affairs, Finance and Planning, Minister of State of the Treasury, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to applaud and welcome my colleague and friend, Mr. Cesar Mba Abogo, Minister of Finance, Economic Affairs and Planning of Equatorial Guinea, for the excellent arrangements made for these meetings and for the concerns he shows for the model of development of my country. So it is quite a delight for me to fulfill this responsibility of sharing our experience. And so, since the discovery of oil, since in the 1970s, Equatorial Guinea embarked on a major program of modernization, social transformation, which has made it today a pole of successful development in Central Africa. However, the decline of oil prices over the years, the country receives from which the country receives about 90% of its revenue, has brought about a slowdown in economic development. This is a sign of alarm on the need to diversify our economies and also boost our resilience. So indeed, Equatorial Guinea in the past has been an agricultural country before the discovery of oil in the 1970s. The quality of its volcanic soil helped it to produce huge quantities of agricultural produce, including cacao, whose quality has been appreciated, and its production tuned about 40,000 tons in 1978, compared to my country, Côte d'Ivoire, which produced about 2 million tons, produced in 1968 about 180,000 tons, while Equatorial Guinea used to produce only 40,000 tons. Unfortunately, today, now the production has declined. It's about less than 1,000 tons here in Equatorial Guinea, and I'm even told it's about 500 tons. What we would like to show here is petrol has annihilated the efforts made in other sectors preventing the country from achieving all its development potentials. This is why I would like to applaud the resolutions of the Socio-Economic National Development of 1991 to diversify the economy of Equatorial Guinea and to invest in its industrialization. Beyond agriculture, this country can have another opinion, another comparative edge in other sectors. For example, tourism, fisheries, petrochemicals. As for agriculture, for exports, and also food agriculture, based on the experience of my country, the sector which is promising can help to improve and can be intensive and protect also the environment. However, we should bear in mind some requirements for success. We have to take into account resilience and inclusiveness. We have to establish documentation based on land ownership, which is very important. So you have to protect agricultural land and also help to provide financing of agricultural activities. Create an environment that is enabling, conducive to investments, which is very important. The state is very competitive when it comes to creating the environment, but creating wealth and richness is the activity of the private sector. And so this is a major requirement for the attraction of investments. We have to invest in human resources, education and quality training and education so that the men and women of this country can be in a good position of actors of development of this country. We have to coach and give counseling to the farmers. The proper coaching for agricultural products is the key to the development in Cote d'Ivoire. So in this regard, scientific resources is also an area where there should be investment in the medium term so as to support agricultural diversification. The locally raw materials should also be processed before exportation. Cote d'Ivoire today is the premier producer of cacao, and the processing of some of these goods is very weak, and the added value is also very weak. So a country like Equatorial, if it wants to diversify agriculture, should avoid the same mistakes made by a country by producing cacao of very good quality and not only the raw material. We should also adhere to the rules of integration, movement of goods and persons. These are principles that we adhere to. The free movement of goods, the free good of human capital, free movement of financial capital. So we believe that is one of the keys to success of integration, but also, why? Because this placates the investors, so it provides a market for the competitiveness of their investment. So we also believe that we should involve the private local sector, the civil society in the construction of the shaping of your vision on regional integration, so for greater inclusiveness. Ladies and gentlemen, apart from agriculture, yes, these requirements are valid for other sectors of diversification which we have just talked about, including, for example, fisheries and petrochemicals, where the production capacity of processing should be improved. We work in Cote d'Ivoire with the African Development Bank for the setting of a project of the chain development of inclusive values, like, for example, industrial pools. It is a platform for infrastructural platform for the value chains for agricultural produce. Mr. Ambo, I'm saying this is with the support of the African Development Bank. So these are concepts, in our view, can be transposed in other sectors. Diversification is available to Equatorial Guinea, so with other areas of industrialization that are improving, so the country should ensure that it has access to regional markets and ensure a successful sub-regional integration, a supply, viable and reliable supply of energy, young manpower, and competitive and so on. I would like to say that I have been invited to make this opening statement. As you know, our country, Cote d'Ivoire, already has a cooperation framework with Equatorial Guinea, so we are therefore ready to share our experience with you, the successes, success stories, and also what should be avoided as part of a partnership framework that is mutually beneficial. Thank you for your kind attention.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you, Honorable Minister. You have displayed all the secrets of your success, so this is quite kind. So we are delighted to have the Minister of Finance of Equatorial Guinea, Mr. Cesar Okomba Abobo, for an exclusive interview.
Minister, thank you once again for the warm welcome that you've given us all here in Malabo in Equatorial Guinea. This is not my first time here, it's actually my 5th time to the country. I've been coming since 2005, and I'm like one of those old uncles when he sees his nephew growing up saying, wow, you've grown up so much. And it's true, in 15 years, the transformation that I've seen, it's a completely different country. So congratulations for everything that you've done, and I know there's a true will to get things done. One word that we seem to hear, and I've seen actually in over the past few years, actually I've been hearing it since 2008, 2009, when we had the global financial crisis followed by an economic crisis, is resilience. The minister mentioned it here, but despite the fall in the price of oil, which came as a shock and a stark reminder, the country has been resilient, and I think that's something that you also pointed out to me, in terms of the resilience and the capacity to bounce back. So can you talk a little bit about the resilience of the economy and your confidence in it to bounce back? And I think the minister may want to speak in Spanish, so headsets for those who don't understand Spanish.
Thank you very much. Okay, primero, podría parecer que nos hemos puesto de acuerdo, Omar y yo, pero parece que ha hecho la introducción de un video que iba a pedir que se pusiera en un rato, un video cortito, que simboliza justamente eso de lo que él estaba hablando, ¿no? Que cuando uno vino aquí, era como un país, un niño, y luego de repente lo ve crecer y no lo reconoce. Así que antes de responder la pregunta, si es posible que los servicios, los asistentes puedan meter el video, por favor. Pero no estaba preparado, ¿eh?
How it was before. How big were our dreams? When everybody told us it was impossible to make it on our own. When everything looked so impossible to achieve.
Have you realized how far have we gone? Have you realized how far can we still go? Have you realized all that we already accomplished together? We are one of the youngest countries in the world and one of the most determined. Your dreams, your inspirations. We are not done in building a country together, but changing our future. The changing our future.
Equatorial Guinea, we are just getting started.
Fantastic, well done.
Les prometo que Omar y yo no nos pusimos de acuerdo antes para esto. Lo puede parecer, pocos lo creerían, pero ha sido completamente improvisado, ni siquiera.
So it is not a display, this was improvised. The question put to me concerns resilience, is about resilience. So we believe that in general, Equatorial Guinea is a resilient country because of its history, and also since its independence until the 1970s, the 1980s, and up till 1990, you are aware of the crisis that erupted in this country during the 1980s. At the beginning of the 1990s, the country was very poor. The country, the economy was bled, yeah, but with the leadership and the foresight of the head of state, Beng, we have been able to be on the right path. We did not encourage fragmentation. We exploited oil. And the country went through accelerated development between 1994 and 2014. We experienced about 22% economic growth, which on average has been spectacular. But as you know, since we come from far also, so this resilience that we are talking about here is linked to the fact that the country, despite the setbacks of the past, has remained united and has been able to come up or create mechanisms for investment and lay the groundwork for sustainable prosperity that is shared by all. So these are characteristics as far as, so this means that by nature we are resilient. So we'd like to see that we have hydrocarbons which have been exploited, the decline in the prices of oil. So what have we done in order to resist all these exogenous or external shocks? Well, how did we remain afloat? Yes, public funds overheated, and we knew that it was going to overheat. We gave priority to the most vulnerable segments of society, those who have fewer resources. We ensured that those vulnerable segments of society do not become victims of the levels of poverty that are unacceptable. So we ensured also that development is not dented. So the pace of growth was maintained. We reduced the economic growth without affecting our development level. We also maintained a level of support to social sectors that were affected. So many jobs were lost, many SMEs were also affected, but the government quickly came up with a mechanism that would prevent the degradation of the situation. And now in 2019, we can say that the economy is coming back on its feet and is on the right track. So today, we are now talking about 0.4%. So things are improving. So we believe the country is resilient. Over the past 4 years, yes, the price of petrol has declined, and as you know, we rely heavily on the oil sector. However, we have been able to remain on the right trajectory with our negotiation mechanism with the national conference. We have been able to trajectory, and process. We have started also the industrialization of the country. We are also thinking of the way of maintaining and consolidating equity through 4 areas of activity. One is geared towards the reduction of poverty and also improvement of the environment, and the other one, the acceleration of the productive fabric, and fourth one, social justice. So this is how we have been able to maintain this resilience and overcome the shocks, and this has all been done in an orderly manner. So it's just a matter of maintaining the improvement that has been made over the past years. We have identified our problems and we've come up with a number of measures, and we have encouraged trans-border trade. We understood exactly. We've taken measures that have been effective. So generally speaking, I can say that we are a resilient country. And thanks to His Excellency, the Head of State, we have been able to make progress because of him. So we have a feeling of pride that helps us to move forward and make progress. So we have to say that since 2015, we have been able to overcome the adverse economic effects and repercussions. And I have said we are handling things properly. Everything is under control. All this shows that Equatorial country is a resilient country. So thank you. Thank you, Honorable Mr. When I talk to investors in general, they say that they are interested in certain things in the country: stability, regulatory framework, and the rule of law. In terms of stability, yes, that exists. What about the regulatory framework and also the rule of law? Yes, yes, regarding what you have just mentioned, but the answer I'm going to be different. If I were an investor, I would first tell him that you have to focus on connectivity. How is the country connected to the rest of the world? Does it produce on the ground, or do they conduct business and so on? We should not do so, just thinking that an investor cannot, for example, an investor cannot come just and simply invest like that. The country is connected, first of all, to the entire world. That's the first thing. As for, yes, the country has human resources, because if you invest in a factory, for example, in a given country, you have to ensure that you are not going to import workers from another country. You have workers in that particular country who can do the work or the job. So number 3, it's the infrastructure, that is the legal infrastructure. Well, in this regard, I have standards. For example, the country is fully connected. The connectivity is not only the roads; you have also the internet. So the country has the fastest optic fiber on the continent. You have digital infrastructure and so on. So the country is well equipped. So it's a matter of managing this infrastructure so that it contributes to competitiveness. So I would like to say here that we have done a great deal of achieve a great deal of progress. Yes, as I've said, we have human resources who will help us in our industrialization. So the burning issue right now, yes, there are studies that are being conducted which show that in 5, 6, 10 years, some skills will no longer be relevant, because the tendency is towards industrialization with new technologies that are changing the reality. So Equatorial Guinea, just like other African countries, we can see all countries of the world must and should look again at their human resources and see whether there is compatibility between human resources and those realities. Yes, at the World Economic Forum, we participated in many forums, and we are members of many bodies. We see the way work is done, the capacity of persons, and so on. But we look also at the future, and we try to build the capacity of persons, build the capacity so that they can manage what they have, so that the economy is more competitive. In this regard, there is, in fact, a report of the World Bank that says that in terms of capacity building or training, the country has made the achieved the greatest progress on the continent. Yes, so we have covered a long way. Yes, you have infrastructure, you have also infrastructure of the legal framework. Yes, there are, if investors want to invest in countries that have connectivity and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, if the laws are not protective, if they are not conducive to the development of these investments, that's a problem. But sometimes some people ignore those laws. Well, here here again, perhaps we have not made the effort necessary for people to understand those laws. So we have to do something. So this is an indicator. You have the doing business criterion that shows that we are being penalized. So there are other standards of the World Bank, like that of Singapore. You have the roadmap and matrices that help us to ensure a proper follow-up of the measures that we might have taken. So all this brings us to the legal structures that help us to promote business. And so that there is ease of doing business. Now, we cannot do this easily just like that. It takes centuries. But now, as you know, things are now done faster. It's just from 3 months to 1 week and so on. We pay taxes predictably and transparently. If I should pay taxes, I contact the services in charge, and I know what I should pay. So these are breakthroughs because of the digitalization of services, public services. So concretely speaking, this has helped to improve the tax system, that's the payment of taxes. The African Development Bank supports us. As for cross-border trade that we are talking about here, as you know, we have welcomed the African Development Bank here to talk about this problem, that is the cross-border trade. Yes, you see women who are engaged in trade, who travel by air to different places and so on. And this phenomenon is changing. Now we have an airline company, a national carrier. There are few national carriers in the region that help us to boost this cross-border trade. So we have to ensure that there is observance of the law. So basically, these are things that we do. We have shown that we are being proactive, and we are preempting things, and we want to make progress. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, you have said that. You have contacted Singapore, and you have geographical strategies that are quite similar. You have gas, you have oil, will explore, and we have also related services. So what have you traded with? What are your areas of trading activities with Singapore? Yes, with Singapore, we have worked on two aspects. First of all, the facility to conduct business. They are a leader in this area, so we have learned a great deal from them. Now, but when it comes to the ease of doing business, we have understood that things should be decided properly, so we have to set up the right mechanisms. We have also learned from Singapore that there is a very important factor, that is the new information technologies and others that help to expedite the implementation of these measures and make them more predictable and transparent. So this is one of the lessons that we have drawn from this cooperation with Singapore. Now, as for our another area, we are working on special economy. We have, as you know, we have a small economy. We have a population of 1 to 2 million, so the economy is a small one. So we have to see how we can make a difference compared with the rest of the world. What should we do so that people come here and choose our country to do business? We are working hand in hand with Singapore in this regard, so as to outline things economically, configure special economic zones, and work on competitiveness and the ease of doing business. We are working with Singapore and South Korea, and we are working also in good faith with this country. So these are countries that are a good example to be emulated, so they can help us to overcome all sorts of difficulties and challenges. So as I've said, we are learning from South Korea, and we have also learned about the value of generosity and also share business. Thank you. Yes, you've talked about collaboration, generosity, and sharing. So in order to ensure greater regional integration, yes, now we will open the floor to the panel. Thank you, Honorable Minister.
Excellent. I'll briefly introduce my panelists. So on my left, I've got former Member of Parliament from South Africa and a former Minister, Honourable Bridget Mbadla. On her left, you've got Mr. Eric Meyer, who is the Assistant Deputy Secretary of the African Department in State Department in the USA. On his left, the Minister, and on his left, you've heard the Honourable Minister Nyale Kaba from Côte d'Ivoire. We'll start with you, Bridget. So Bridget works for the Africa Peer Review Mechanism, which I believe was founded some 15 years ago. I was there at the launch. And it's a mechanism to peer review countries. So countries apply to be reviewed. So they're reviewed by their peers. And then a report is presented to them to improve issues of governance and the way their affairs are conducted ultimately. So I know you've got a lot of very interesting examples, but the first question I wanted to ask you is, how strong is the link between governance and macroeconomic performance or economic growth? Is there a link? Is there a correlation?
Indeed, there is. In fact, I think it's correct to say that governance underpins economic development. This is what we found with our reviews. We have 38 countries of the AU that have acceded to the mechanism, and we have reviewed about 23 of those countries. Our finding is that countries that have undergone the review have invariably improved in terms of their drive for economic development. They have succeeded in harnessing solidarity from other members of the peer review mechanism and have strengthened their institutions. There is a lot of solidarity amongst members. And of course, there are costed plans of action that derive from the findings of the reviews. So I can say very succinctly that indeed there is an effect, a positive one at that.
And so how are countries using the APRM to improve governance and to improve policies? Have you got clear-cut examples there?
Yes. Let me perhaps use Kenya. Kenya has actually undergone a second review. And in the first review, corruption was flagged, and they have since been working at improving systems to counter the corruption that has occurred. In fact, in the restructuring, they've developed plans for county administrations. Uganda is one other interesting example. They also have undergone a second review. They benefited from the findings of the review to the extent that I think in the second review, they improved their decentralization model. You would recall, I think, that there were difficulties in the earlier years in the north, but I think the benefit is even wider than that. Because of county, what you'd call decentralization, they've managed to track movement of displaced persons. They now know the extent of refugees that have come into their country. And of course, the challenge is that of the use of land in some of the most extreme rural areas, because ordinary hospitality of people was to allocate their own land to those that have come in. But here is the point. The point is that planning improved invariably in many of the countries that underwent the review. The important one that I'd like to mention is that Rwanda was one of the first countries to be reviewed, and they have a governance entity, which was a direct result of the findings of that review of the APRM. So I think those examples do show improvement.
Okay, so a person we all admire and a great sister of ours is Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the former finance minister of Nigeria, also World Bank managing director. And in one of my first interviews with her, and it was at the time when actually Belgium had gone, I can't remember how many months, but many months, maybe 8, 9, 10 months without an official government. But actually the question she asked me, she said, can you name me the president of Switzerland? So I couldn't, obviously. And then she also said, and name me the head of state of Belgium. And obviously they didn't have a head of state at the time. So I said, I don't, because they don't have one. She says, the point is, my dear friend, it's the institutions in those countries that matter. It's not necessarily the people. It's institutions. The institutions are strong. People have trust in those institutions, and therefore they continue investing in those countries, and the countries continue performing very strongly. So in terms of the APRM, do you help countries build those institutional frameworks and work on having these strong institutions?
Yes, indeed. We have done so in many an instance, and very common its capacity in the area of financial management. We have working, by the way, the ADB is a strategic partner of the APRM, and we have not only used their database, but we have reverted to them when we needed certain types of expertise to attach to countries that require the kind of specialized help. It is true that to a large extent, governance is anchored by strong, but of course you need political will, you need leadership. South Africa prides itself with a judiciary that is strong and judged to be resilient. And of course, we have a very able state department, statistical department, that has been called upon on numerous occasions to help and enable countries that were being reviewed or had been reviewed and found to be needing a strengthening of capacity.
Thank you. Eric, if I may come to you. So when I look at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is obviously one instrument to finance countries that are in need of finance, but ultimately they need to meet certain criteria. And when I went on the website, it said you help countries who are committed to good governance, economic freedom, and investing in their citizens. Do you think these are sort of core principles for economic growth and for countries to succeed?
Thank you, Omar. Yes, I think the standards that the Millennium Challenge Corporation uses to decide which countries are eligible for potential compacts is a useful guide to what are the key factors. It is issues of governance, that's institutions, but as we just heard, it does also include political will and leadership for driving forward reforms. Institutions are great for maintaining the reforms and keeping things going, but you do need that political will and leadership, and you need to be able to demonstrate a track record of progress in those areas. Similarly, on issues of economic freedom, this is really about doing business, as we heard from both of our earlier speakers about the efforts to improve the business and investment climate and how important that is to attracting investment and leading to diversification and ultimately to creating jobs in countries. So that's really critical. And what we know is sustainable economic growth requires strong investment in your population, in their education, the health. You cannot have a strong workforce if they are not healthy. You cannot have a productive workforce if they are not well educated and have the right skills to bring to the job. Those are prerequisites to that longer term sustainable growth. So we think these are critical elements.
So you mentioned skills, and the minister also mentioned skills earlier on. I was watching this interview with Tim Cook, so the CEO of Apple, and he said there's a confusion about China. He said China stopped being a low labor cost country many years ago, and that people come to China because of its skill, the quantity of its skill and the type of skill. And so they've got great tooling engineers, and they invested in vocational training many years ago when everyone stopped investing in vocational training. And vocation expertise is very deep. So when it comes to advice that you may give or your views on the skills and the skills gap and where people should be training and what part of education should you be investing in? You mentioned it. We talk about education. But is it vocational training? Is it scientists? Is it IT? What are the what's the bet?
So, I mean, I think you have to have a strong primary education to set the foundation. And I think with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and development partners, a lot of progress has been made in that across the continent. We've seen tremendous gains in primary education outcomes, really almost everywhere. But what is needed after that, I think, is going to vary somewhat. It's going to vary depending on where the comparative advantages are, what sectors have the most potential in countries. Not everyone is going to need a university level education, and you will need people who have a lot of very specific skills, whether that is in industry and logistics and manufacturing, or whether it's in the service sector. A skill such as having a workforce, if you've got a focus on tourism, that has the ability to speak English or French or German or Spanish is critical to being able to attract and deliver the level of service that's required. So I think it will vary somewhat. I think you've got a lot of experience in Africa on a small scale in things like high tech. We have great tech incubators in Accra, in Lagos, in Dakar, in Nairobi, in South Africa, in Addis. So you've got a lot of places where that's being done. Of course, it needs to be brought up to scale and to be delivered to a wider group of the population so that there's more opportunity created there.
And so you're telling me that next week you're off to Maputo, and I believe that you're going to unveil the government approach to boosting trade and investment between the US and African countries. Can you give us a little preview? I don't want to steal the thunder from next week's conference, but the broader lines.
All right. Well, thank you, Omar. I think a lot of people here may also be hopefully going down to Maputo, and it's the Corporate Council for Africa, a U.S. trade and business organization focused on boosting development, trade, and investment between Africa and the United States, are hosting their summit in Maputo next week, where many of us, many of my government counterparts are going to join together. We'll be talking about our long-standing and deep trade and investment relationships across the African continent, which have been grounded in long support. You mentioned the Millennium Challenge Corporation. We have trade and investment hubs across Africa that are run by USAID. And we have almost 20 years of experience in offering unilateral trade access and benefits to African countries under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA. And that has set a good foundation, but we're determined to do better. We're determined to go farther and to boost the levels of trade and investment. And so we'll be talking about a new initiative called Prosper Africa, which will seek to build stronger ties between our business communities and to better utilize the resources across the U.S. government. We have a lot of government agencies that have elements of assisting in trade and investment, in making aware to businesses, both African businesses as well as American businesses, what the potential is on the continent. So we'll be talking a little bit more about how we're going to do that in practical terms.
Fantastic. Madame la Ministre, si je peux...
Honourable Minister, I'd like to ask you a question on negotiations.
Had in Africa is each country has had to negotiate as one against bigger partners such as the EU, China, etc. Hopefully, when we see the realization of the African Continental Free Trade Area, we're going to be able to negotiate as one vis-à-vis these bilateral partners. I see that Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, who are producing between, let's say, 70 and 80% of global cocoa, is still dependent on external parties determining the price of cocoa. And I believe that you're getting together to try and have a minimum price of $2,600 per ton. So this is an example of collaboration between two countries to determine the price at which they feel is fair they should be getting for the cocoa. Can you tell us a little bit about how that collaboration and that negotiation, or how that's taking place and how that collaboration first started?
Thank you for that question. As you've rightly said, we are major cocoa producers and coffee producers too. We have gone through market law, despite the fact that we produce the raw material. Côte d'Ivoire in the past tried to regulate its market without much success, unfortunately. And we attempted to address the issue by processing the raw material locally. We've had some significant results, but they've been slow. We are only processing approximately 33%, and we've not yet reached the end of the processing chain. Recently, we approached our neighbor to see how we could pool our efforts to try to ensure that we get a good price for this product. So we are major producers on the global market, and we have just begun a partnership. It's a raw materials market. It's by supply and demand. There are several strategies in play, including pooling our efforts to try to improve our processing. That is key when we try to coordinate our marketing policies, as well as ensure that most of the raw materials remain in our markets. There are common initiatives being undertaken, joint initiatives, and there's an announcement made in this regard. But as I said, we are building a strategy together, and in the coming months, we will see what form it will take. We are supported by development partners, and I'd like to thank the African Development Bank and the World Bank are trying to help us build joint strategies to support the local processing of cocoa. It is extremely important. They are using innovative approaches that will help us ensure that local agriculturalists then have markets. We have ambitious targets for the processing in the short term. In our sub-regional policies, we are trying to coordinate negotiations, but we've not have much success in our raw material policy.
The other day that a country like Vietnam, it's now one of the top 5, I believe, in terms of shipbuilding. And in 2002, shipbuilding sector was more or less non-existent. So government took a very deliberate policy choices to develop the shipbuilding sector. And so they obviously protected the local industry. They gave subsidized loans. They reinvested the corporation tax from those companies, exemptions of rent, land, etc., etc. So there was a clear determination, and there's a clear deliberate policy. And I believe it's what you'd call state development or development state central to policy. So, Minister, if I can come to you again. So, do you believe, first of all, that we need to be a bit more, I don't want to say aggressive, but a bit more determined in terms of protecting from foreign competition some of our local industries to help them grow and to help them with subsidized loans and other such incentives to build true national champions and now hopefully with a bigger market for them to operate in with the Continental Free Trade Area, they will be able to service these bigger markets and become regional champions. This is to César, sorry.
Ah, to me?
Yeah.
Okay, you said minister.
Yeah, I know, sorry.
Ok, bien, creo que sinceramente hay que pensar en términos de cómo hacer competitivas empresarial. Creo que es la clave, pero no podemos ser naif.
Think about how we can come up with a strategy.
Hay un ejemplo, a raíz de lo que decía la ministra Niele Caba antes, que me gustaría dar aquí. Yo no tomo café.
I would like to point to, for example, I don't drink coffee, but I do have friends, and it would seem that 4% of the value of coffee that we drink goes to the farmers, and the rest is value added. I therefore believe that in Africa we should be thinking about this. And in any case, it's not all the value added that should come to our countries. We should be able to have this value added in any country, in African country, say Cameroon, for example, Cote d'Ivoire also. I think we can process this coffee or sell it, this value added, and the process will come back to the continent. So I think we will not be able to strengthen competition in our countries by keeping our nations the way they are. We have to work as a continent. That way the value chain will be at the level of the continent and not just at the level of each country. I'm aware that there are things that keep on coming on, and of course each problem has its own reasons, but we should be looking for competitiveness at the same time as we're thinking about integration of the African continent. The question, however, is if I don't have the requisite technology, I don't have the skills or the capacity to market this, maybe South Africa has it, and if it doesn't, maybe Cote d'Ivoire has it. In that case, I think we should defend our interests by pulling together our skills. I think this should be the way forward, and this issue of regional integration for shared prosperity is of utmost importance. For example, and here I don't want to raise any polemics, I don't want to be polemical. This morning, some people rightly complained that we're drinking imported water, whereas we have water resources in Equatorial Guinea, and even if we don't, other African countries have it. That's the only way we can ensure that we have prosperity and employment in our countries. Now we have lots of challenges that we have to address, and I think that what's normal is if we don't have water here, we should turn to our neighbors, Cameroon and other countries, where I'm sure we can work with our Cameroonian brothers for them to provide us with the water. That way, water produced by Cameroon should be competitive and sold in Equatorial Guinea. And this can be done as part of regional integration. I think there are lots of things that we can do together and well. And by doing them, we can, for example, ensure diversification of the oil sector from pure oil to, refining the oil. And we should be able to build industrial complexes and wouldn't lose any component of our gas. We should be able to process all of this into butane gas and even methanol. And by doing that, part of the methanol can come from Equatorial Guinea, and that can be processed into liquefied gas. So, you see, I think we can put in place industrial complexes that can also serve the needs of other countries within the region. The key point here is we shouldn't be trying to protect industries in Equatorial Guinea because they are Guinean. No, the value chain should include the whole of the continent. That way we'll be better integrated and more competitive. This is our vision, and this is our thinking as far as regional integration is concerned for shared prosperity. And of course, if we want to be prosperous, we need peace. We can't be prosperous if we don't live in peace. So, to maintain peace, we need to adopt the proper mechanisms. And as the Honorable Minister said, we need to know exactly how to use the mechanisms we share to have more peace and more enhanced stability. And these mechanisms should be strong enough for the continent to really achieve integration. So this is our integration. The integration of the value chain should be at the level of the continent. That way, we'll be able to pool together. And I don't want to be polemical, as I said at the beginning, but many people believe, for example, that they should only consider their own enterprises. If, for example, my sister wants to take Air Cote d'Ivoire, and then we have Seba, which is also going in the same direction, I think we should be able to communicate better among ourselves, between us, to understand the situation. And I think this also applies to the other governors. For some of them, in order to reach here, they had to go through many other countries. So I think that we can harness, that we can strengthen, but we need to, of course, work in close concert with our neighbors. We admire the work, the great work that Cote d'Ivoire is doing. And in fact, we hope to benefit from the example of Cote d'Ivoire. And the Honorable Minister would hope that you'll be able to transfer skills to help us move faster in what we're doing. And we believe that with your assistance, we've understood that regional integration requires the integration of ideas, exchange of ideas, because it is only by doing this that we'll be more competitive in the world in which we live today. A world that is characterized less by trade than by processing. So in general, we need to develop those factors that are available to us, and of course build on our synergies. I'm not defending protectionism of states, but rather strengthening the capacities, the economic structures of Africa for us to be more competitive. And this requires that we scale up the value chain at the level of Africa. Thank you.
Maybe we come to you, Eric.
Thank you very much. I know you'll have to take your flight. We would like to ask you a question.
So, but not necessarily do you recommend or do you advise, but how do you see African countries such as Côte d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and Equatorial Guinea, for example, collaborate to build a big petrochemical or to develop a big petrochemicals industry and petrochemicals company? Is there, do you see that happening now that we've got the Continental Free Trade Agreement and an emphasis on greater regional integration, a collaboration like we've seen with Airbus in Europe and other such examples?
Well, I think it's a good question, and as the minister was saying, I think you have to look at this from a regional and an African-wide perspective. This continent will have the population and the economic power in the next century to be a driver of global growth. It needs to have the companies that are able to actively participate in that. And, it will require cross-country collaboration, and I think that's the vision of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which we strongly support. Opening up borders and improving opportunities for trade across Africa is a key part of that economic future. African countries need to trade with other African countries, whether we're talking about North Africa or West Africa or East Africa or in Southern Africa. The level of interregional trade is relatively small even today. It's growing, and in certain regional economic communities, it's gotten much better. But that needs to happen across the whole continent. And as the minister was saying, I think this is a case of figuring out where your strategic priorities are, figuring out where your comparative advantages are, and then looking on how to build those by working with your neighbors. If you want to build an oil and gas industry here, does every part of it have to be here? Not necessarily. Parts could be elsewhere in the region. Your example, I think, when you were interviewing the minister at the beginning on, Singapore as a central hub for oil and gas services. Singapore has no oil and gas, but it got there by working on a regional basis and looking more broadly. If African companies and African countries have an open mind and an ability to do that, I think there is an example and a potential for success. We see pieces of that. I think it's also important to be open to foreign direct investment. There are world-class players that can come and invest in Africa and can serve as a foundation for those exact same kinds of industries. And I think here in Equatorial Guinea, we have a number of American oil companies that have played a very, very important role in the developments in that sector here over the last 20 years. And I think you can see that elsewhere in the continent as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Eric. If I could come to you, in terms of, we spoke about the minister spoke about the lessons learned from Côte d'Ivoire and that they're implementing here in Equatorial Guinea. So I wanted to look at the African institutional framework and how institutions such as yours, so the regional institutions, how they are helping countries to improve their policy and to share ideas and share best practice.
At the sitting of the AU in January, the peer review mechanism was assigned the task of assisting all 54 countries on the continent with matters of governance. It's a very huge mandate, a very important mandate. It implies that we also have to enable appropriate tooling for countries to be able to institutionalize good governance and be efficient in the running of government, of the various governments on the continent. So I think that the impact and importance of the work of the APRM is just unfolding. And it's precisely because of that observation that the heads of state decided that whilst initially it was by choice that countries became a part of the APRM, but now they are saying no. In terms of Vision 2063, your sustainable goals, you should be the key institution on the continent that pursues that. But also, one of the positive outcomes of our work is that of early warning, almost enabling countries to recognize elements that may lead to conflict in their countries or in their regions. So I think it's work in progress. And I think that there would be tools that will be developed in the coming 5 years that would enable an acceleration of good governance on the continent. Just to indicate, for example, that inclusivity is very key, by the way, to peace and stability, and also to nurturing a sustainable development. And that can only be realized if there is good neighborhood, if there are common values of what is right and what is wrong. I don't want to use concepts such as democracy, which are widely interpreted and differently so. But here's the point, is that we need to have certain values such as, for example, the recognition of diversity, cultural, religious, and thus not to exclude persons that are ordinarily marginalized because of religion, culture, etc. The question of gender inequality is a challenge on the continent, and failure to accord equality and equal opportunities affect the socioeconomic development of many countries on the continent, and this is one of our findings. The majority of countries are populated by largely the young people. Surely we should find solutions for the youth of the continent. And I think that that would lie in ways of improving governance, inclusivity, and having their voices heard, and offering them opportunities for development. It is time really for Africa to pay attention to its youth. And I think the work of the API outcomes of that kind.
Thank you. I mean, you raise a very important point in terms of social cohesion. You won't have sustained economic growth without social cohesion. Interestingly, we always boast that Africa's got 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies. We also have 7 of the 10 most unequal economies or countries in the world. So obviously inequality is another issue that's important. In terms of the model that we should adopt, I was also reading about Thailand, which is interesting in that they've had 19 coups, but they still managed to boast some of the most successful exports and a fantastic agricultural sector. So there's not necessarily that correlation, that instability doesn't necessarily mean you cannot industrialize, but we won't go down that route. The route I wanted to go down, actually, is the public versus private sector investment. Ultimately, in this country, we saw massive public investment and a massive construction boom for a decade or so. And obviously, when that public investment fell, we didn't see the private sector step in. So it's over-reliant on public investment to drive growth. And I know that, again, Ivory Coast has gone on a massive infrastructure program, massive public investment program. And really what we now need to do is to make sure that the private sector can step in, especially as fiscal space is quite tight. But the problem that I have with the private sector in Africa in general is that it doesn't take enough risk. We can just look at the energy sector and the independent power producers. If you compare statistics worldwide, you'll see that in Africa, no independent power producer goes bust. Why? Because the off-taker, the government generally, guarantees a certain price and certain revenues. Whilst in other parts of the world, the independent power producers, there'll be a 5 to 10% failure rate. So my problem is, how can we make the private sector take more risks in our economies? And maybe we'll ask the Honourable Minister from Côte d'Ivoire in terms of encouraging private sector investments and making sure that private sector takes over from government to drive growth.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. We recognize that we are an open economy, and we admit it. We pay pride of place in our development programs to private investments. And this has been the case in the past. For the state has concentrated on putting in place infrastructure and the regulatory framework and left room for the private sector to create wealth, to create jobs. Of course, we worked at length on doing business through our investment code, and in the past through specific conventions that we entered into. Today, the state continues to enhance the private sector environment. It is true that we have independent producers of power producers. The state does not produce power directly, even though it guarantees that this is done through different guarantee mechanisms. But we are enhancing, improving the process. As has been said, we need to create the enabling conditions for the competitiveness of enterprises. And I think this is really the importance of these entities that we want to create. If we want to attract the private sector, then the private sector must benefit from competitive conditions to be able to assure itself that it can, that whatever it's doing is profitable. We're working a lot with our neighbors. We have the WAMU market well developed. We're working hard to improve on integration within the ECOWAS space. We still have to fine-tune some of this. And we believe this will reassure investors that they have a bigger market. Now, in the specific instance of power, as you're aware, Côte d'Ivoire is benefiting from the support of development partners to position itself as a hub as far as supply of power to sub-regions is concerned. We supply power right now to a few countries, a few neighboring countries. Burkina Faso, Mali, Ghana, even though I believe the Ghana case is coming to an end because they have the capacity. We also have Liberia, Guinea. We are putting in place the infrastructure necessary for that. And I think opening up this market will guarantee that the state is able to live, because we'll have an investment framework and potential market for the state to reassure enterprises that they can continue to work and stay in our countries to do business. Recently, we adopted an investment code that is more attractive, so that we can do away with specific conventions. We're also working on specific codes in different sectors to ensure that investors that come to our country are willing to take more risk. And this is in line with the incentives, the framework, reforms, and the opening up and broadening of our market. I think this is a process that will gain momentum. Thank you very much.
The private sector needs to be a bit bolder. And do you think it's what do you think is holding back private sector taking more risk on the African continent and in a country like Equatorial Guinea than elsewhere?
Bien, voy a hablar desde la parte guineana porque nosotros
Well, I'll give you the perspective of Equatorial Guinea because we're a small-sized economy. Just about 2 million inhabitants and a small land area. And sometimes what we do here is not readily applicable to other countries. As the Honorable Minister Kaba said, she congratulated us on our infrastructural development. But I said, yes, we have resources. We invested these resources in a responsible manner. But of course, bear in mind that Equatorial Guinea, that is 1/4 the population of Abidjan. So we're talking at different levels and different ways of looking at the problems. And the private sector should play a leading role. We are all aware that as far as our countries are concerned, what you said is true, and that's that enterprises depend more on public contracts. And they were not taking much risk. And we said Equatorial Guinea is resilient. We have the capacity to adapt to changing times. And not only what government is doing, but we want to thank the private sector and what it is doing. We have someone in the room here, and we have it's an incubator doing a great job. And they bring together entrepreneurs, and they organize themselves. And we have enterprises that provide microfinance, which wasn't the case in the past. And today, the youth who want to do this, and even those who are not so young, can access financing. But how can they obtain these resources to be able to launch their own enterprises? Clearly, the administration has an important role to play, and we also have to reduce the risk for banks, because banks see risk in this youth, but this risk has to be mitigated for them to benefit from loans. So the administration has a role to play, and the conference that we organized recently dealt with the issue of mobilization of resources, and it was one of the highlights of the conference. And we're talking about the public and the private sector. We invited different institutions, the AFDB, the World Bank, and so on, because there are service products that, of course, are addressed to the private sector. So let me say that the major problem we face has to do with the cost of preparing our banking system to finance enterprises that take more risk, and also the capacity of enterprises to structure the projects and to come up with financing they need. But we know that there's some marked improvement over the last few years, particularly over the last. We introduced automated systems in industry, which and somebody may think this is goes against the grain of job creation. No, but it shows our capacity to adapt. It shows that we have a lot of imagination. And today, we should be looking at how we can reduce the risk for banks, the risk of lending money, and how we are facilitating access to financing, because that is what matters in the final analysis. Yes, you can improve on the business climate, but in the final analysis, the person taking the risk, the enterprise taking the risk, and facilitating the work of the private sector so that they can make this financing available. Thank you.
So just to summarize some of what we've discussed, it's too much to summarize in a few seconds, but ultimately, I think the step to, or the path to development is, has to be deliberate. Has to be deliberate policy. The leadership, there has to be the leadership at the top to drive those reforms, and then the institutions to make sure that...
Of course.
And that the country ultimately is stable as well in terms of social cohesion, etc. Solidarity and partnerships, that's what it's all about. And hopefully we'll manage to break the information asymmetry so that African countries can share success stories, can partner together, and can build the opportunity and the continent that we all want. As the African Development Bank says, 1 billion people, 1 billion opportunities. Thank you very much, everyone. A round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.
Momwa bende bola mondo biso disi mende tu kwato bunya. Momwa bende bola